Good afternoon, everyone. Good afternoon. Hello. We've arrived here this afternoon. Welcome to all of you. I ask if you could find yourself your spot to sit. As usual, there's a few up front that are empty. Welcome, everyone. It's very exciting to welcome each and every one of you to this EverWonder conference. We've gathered from near and far. You're meeting each other already. We're gathering to connect with one another, and we're gathering to build new friendships and to strengthen old ones. And we acknowledge our conference theme as we gather here today. That in the midst of much inhumanity in our world, we're here to awaken to our highest humanity, to nurture our capacity to be true to our deepest selves, more compassionate, more loving, more just. That's not a tall order, is it? But we're excited that we get to explore those themes with one another and talk about the lives that we're living and how we might live them for each other and with deep compassion, love, and justice. As we do whenever we gather in this space, we're going to light a candle. And as we light this candle, we're going to remember and recognize that we're all one, we're of the same substance, we're of the same human race. We're of the same stardust. And to recognize that in this weekend, we're going to explore with openness, with respect for our diversity. Not about agreement in this space. We'll have a lot of conversations over the weekend, but a space to explore, which will both strengthen and resolve and challenge our notions and conceptions. And we welcome all of it. We are gathered here in this space as the second time we've gathered as an EverWonder conference, and we bring to this group and this time our own experiences of wisdom to this weekend. We will commit to learning from each other, to open ourselves to the paths and experiences of others, not just that we're meeting now, but ones that we have yet to meet over the course of the weekend, and the myriad ways to be expansive, to be progressive, to be open, loving, compassionate, and just in our traditions. And so, as this light burns among us, let's remember our commitments to each other, to the openness we find here as we open this, our EverWonder conference.
As we gather, each time we gather in this space, we acknowledge that we meet on Treaty 6 territory. In this gathering here, we honor that the traditional territory on which we gather has a long history, reaching well beyond the history of its colonization and the establishment of European communities. We recognize the significance for the Indigenous people who have lived on this land long, whose continuous presence in this territory, whose practices and whose spiritualities were tied to this land, and who continue to develop in relationship to this land and to all of its inhabitants. We gather here in gratitude for the Cree people, the Papas-Chase Nation, for the Métis of Central Alberta, for the First Peoples for whom this was a gathering place, a meeting ground, a traveling route, for those who have for generations and generations called it home. And we also acknowledge the hurt and the harm that has transpired between Indigenous and non-Indigenous. We gather here with each other with a commitment that our words might lead to actions, and that we might continue to build relationships with the hope of a more reconciling and partnering future with one another. We're going to sing about that commitment in a piece that Chris has written called Reconciling Ways. We're going to take a moment to hear the melody, and then we're going to sing that commitment, reminding ourselves of this storied land on which we're privileged to gather.
A gentleman is going to make his way to the piano. His name is Scott Kearns. He's going to help us sing through the weekend. And I just want to say a little bit about Scott, because Scott is more talented than he would ever admit himself. But he is a brilliant piano player, a composer, an improviser. Many of you have sung some of the music that he's written, whether in this community or in other communities that you're familiar with. As the music director of West Hill United Church in Scarborough, he's written so many pieces for their Sunday gatherings and special occasions, and he's collected those songs in 2 songbooks, The Wonder of Life and Songs for Anyone, which are here on a table today for you to have a look at. Scott is completing a doctoral program in theological studies at York University, and when Scott isn't busy doing that and doing music directing and doing all the wonderful things that he does in his life, he's working as a registered social worker. So his life is full and busy. He'll be playing many of his songs with us this weekend, and a few that aren't his, like this one, that we're going to sing together. So we welcome Scott on the piano and with us through the weekend, and let's again join our voices together so that we can sing our way into this time with each other deep in our hearts. So one of the really great ways to just figure out who we are in this room, I think you know who you are, but let's figure out who we are together. We just want to kind of get a sense of where we're from at the outset. So we're going to do this thing where, if you're able to, we're gonna all wave our hands when I say a location or an area, and we'll get to kind of see around the room where we're from. So the first thing we're going to do is probably the biggest. So let's just start with the biggest. And I don't mean the greater Edmonton area. I mean Edmonton. Like if you are from within the Edmonton city limits, inside or outside the Henday, but within Edmonton city limits, just raise your hand, wave your hand. Okay, there we are. Now let's extend the boundaries a little bit. You know, there's all those communities and cities and towns around Edmonton within, 25 kilometers of Edmonton. If you're from the surrounding area, wave your hands. Oh yeah, great. Next, how about the rest of Alberta? If that wasn't you, but you still live in Alberta, wave your arms. Oh yeah, a couple. That's great. Welcome. Let's just dip west just temporarily, because there's just a little bit to go. If you're from BC, wave your arms. There we go. A number of you. Welcome. Okay, now U-turn. Head east, the prairies, Saskatchewan and Manitoba. Look at all these people from the prairies. Look at you. And most of you probably from Saskatoon. If you're not from Saskatoon, raise your... Aha. So it's not all Saskatoon people. That's great. Welcome. How about Central Canada, Ontario, Quebec, that kind of thing? Well, we wondered if there'd be more, but here we go. Welcome. Greta and Scott. The Maritimes. There you are. Welcome. Do I have to go? Anyone else? North, south? No. Then we've done it. We've covered it. Well, welcome all of you. That's great that we are here together from lots of different places.
And we want to meet some of our workshop leaders who are able to be here with us today, and we'll meet a couple of others tomorrow. So I'll just get you to wave, and we can identify those folk. You might not be in their session, but you'll have an opportunity over lunch or dinner to connect with them and chat with them about the work that they do, or the topic that they're interested in, that they're sharing with us while we're gathered. So I want to start with Catherine Weinman. Catherine, if you want to wave to us. Catherine describes herself as a student seeker, a mentor champion, a process artist, conversation host, an edge walker, bridge builder, a solitary soul community impressionero, and a wicked cook. And many of us have met Catherine through her Circle Way practice, and she's not a stranger to this space, having convened and hosted a circle here. Catherine's going to lead a workshop helping us to sit together in a circle and ponder our limiting beliefs about our own creativity, and to invite us into a chance to practice some expression of that creativity. And so, Catherine, we welcome you and look forward to the opportunity to engage around creativity with you. So welcome.
I want to introduce you to Brett McKay. Brett, could you give us a wave? He's back there with the camera. Brett is a writer and musician, lifelong student, and Brett practices simplicity without being simple. Is that fair to say? Brett's part of the SSU SSUC team as our communications coordinator, and this weekend he'll be leading a workshop about what he's learned about living with less and living more deeply that way. Not just to reduce what we have, but to replace it with a sustainable peace and a wholeness in our living. So Brett, we look forward to that tomorrow, and thank you for being here.
And I want to introduce Stephen Ingalls. Stephen, welcome. We're glad you're here. Stephen isn't a stranger to this community either, and Stephen's been an outreach worker, a martial arts instructor, and he's a practicing yoga instructor, a graduate of St. Stephen's College here in Edmonton, and he's going to... Is that a in process? Yes, yes. I'm predicting the future. And Stephen's going to help us become a bit more aware of what's required in order for us to be truly present, and it begins with our breath. So those of you who will have the opportunity to be with Stephen tomorrow in his workshop, and others of you a chance to chat with him in breaks and over meals today and tomorrow.
I'm now going to talk briefly about Alison Brooks Starks, right over here. Alison is a familiar face to us here at SSUC. She's been part of our work and ministry through her work with young adult LGBTQ community, outdoor programs with Emberwood, with Rainbow Connection, and is passionate about the intersection of nature and spirituality. And we've had the great pleasure of experiencing some programs and times with her doing just that, and she will be taking a lucky group of workshop participants outdoors tomorrow for a decidedly human experience in our natural world. So for those of you that are a part of that, you get to experience that. For others that are curious and excited by those words that I just said and what Alison is doing, you'll have a chance to talk to her over the weekend. Thanks, Alison.
And I want to also introduce Henriette Kelker. Give us a wave, Henriette. Henriette is also part of the SSUC community and also the St. Stephen's College community. Loves to be outdoors and loves building opportunities to bridge the gaps of age and language and culture. Henriette's workshop, The Power of Ritual, will explore the layers of meaning and its place in our lives. And we encourage you to talk with her about that, or talk with her about St. Stephen's College, the work that's happening there. And Henriette, we really welcome you and look forward to what you bring to our time together. We have a couple other workshop leaders that we'll meet tomorrow in our time together, but here's a chance for us to welcome these that we've introduced, those that we've had conversations with, and those that we've yet to have conversations with, as we sing about belonging. And this is an opportunity for us to think about, it's not really any accident that we're here in this space with one another. It's essential that each of you are here. We are who we are together because you've made the changes and choices and arranged your lives to be here. So we want to sing to affirm that we each belong, and we belong to this time that we're gathered. We belong to these communities with whom we're connecting, communities we are making with each other. And we sing that affirmation as a way of welcoming one another into this time and into this experience we'll share. We're going to sing a piece of music that Chris has written about belonging. So as you take your place and as you inhabit your space, we hope you'll feel a sense of at-homeness and a sense of making a home with each other in this time. This experience wouldn't be the same without you. We're each essential to creating the community we build with each other. So we're exploring together our deepest and highest humanity. How do we talk about that? And for some of us, it has to do with the values we hold and we use as kinds of signposts, whether that's kindness or compassion or love or justice or some of these amazing words that we have before us, or whether it's other countless kinds of touchstones that we want at the center of our lives and our living. We're going to explore those questions and those themes with one another in this time we share together.
One of the ways that we explore those values in our life and what it means to be human, we explore that best when we hear deeply one another's stories, when we listen intently, and when we hear the things that connect us, that go beyond what we've been taught, that go beyond our upbringing, our backgrounds, that go beyond any group that we might belong to, but that go to the depth of the things that make us human. That's when we really open ourselves to the possibilities that exist outside of our own experience. Jean Vanier, a Canadian philosopher, theologian, humanitarian who founded l'Arche, an international group of communities for people with developmental disabilities and those who assist them, and who died just this last May. Vanier was asked in 2015, what does it mean to be human? I think he was asked that question quite a lot. He spent a lot of time thinking, writing, and speaking about that. And we want to show you this video clip right now of Jean Vanier's answer, some of his response to that question when he was asked, what does it mean to you to be human?
Fundamentally, to develop the heart is to see that in each person you are beautiful. You see, the whole thing with human beings is to learn to love. And to love is not to do things for people. It's not to tell people what to do. It's to reveal. What do we reveal? You're important. You might be important in the things you do, but there's something even more important than what you do. It's who you are. And who you are is something about your heart, by being open to others. A heart that is not filled with fear. The problem today is that many people are filled with fear. They are frightened of people, frightened of losing. And because people are filled with fear, they can no longer be open to others. They're protecting themselves, protecting their class, protecting their group, protecting their religion. We're all in a state of protection. To become fully human is to let down the barriers, to open up, and to discover that every person is beautiful. Under all their jobs they're doing, responsibilities, there is you. And you, at the heart of who you are, you're somebody also crying out, does somebody love me? Not just for what I can do, but for who I am. So to be fully human is the development of the heart and the head, and then we can become one inside of us. Becoming one inside of us, we can little by little let down the ego, the need to prove that I am better than you. And then I can begin to see in other people, other groups, other religions, other cultures, that people are wonderful. And then we can come and we can work for peace together.
So we're going to ponder that same question, how we might answer that question for ourselves just at this point in our lives. What does it mean for us each as we're thinking about it at this time in our life? What does it mean to be human? Or what are the values that center our life as a human that are most important to us right now?
Another workshop that you might be attending tomorrow will be led by the vocal group Nefesh Spirit from SSUC Saskatoon. And want to introduce them to you now. And the best way to meet this group is to hear them sing. They have voices that are worth hearing. So I want to introduce you to Dawn Gunther and Judy Gunther, Deb Gunther Hansen, Kathy Daneko, and Wynn Thompson. And they are going to come and offer a song this afternoon for us called Peacefully Drift. Nefesh Spirit, everyone.
Somebody thinks we're really tall. I'm just going to say a couple of words first, if that's all right, as a bit of an introduction. So we are 4 of the 5 women from Saskatoon called Nefesh Spirit. We experience our deepest humanity in the sharing of music with each other and with others. We take our name from the Hebrew tradition. The word Nefesh has multiple layered meanings around our bodies, our breath, and our inner selves. The most basic of these references is to our throat, the taking in and releasing of that which nourishes and informs emotions, minds, passions, desires, sensations. We share Nefesh with you this weekend. We are also members of a Saskatoon chapter of an international network called Threshold Choirs. We sing to bring ease and comfort to those who are seriously ill or dying, or at other threshold moments in their life. Today, we especially wish to remember and dedicate our song to Mark and his family. Mark was an amazing boy that I worked and played with for many years as a pediatric physical therapist, and his funeral was this afternoon. So here's to Mark. That's too low. Live deeply in this moment. Find the stillness deep inside. Enter the quiet, the calm inner space, and peacefully drift, peacefully drift, peacefully.
A year and a half ago or so, Dawn and I had the privilege of gathering with the community, the Unitarian community in Victoria, and met Shauna and her wife Melora, who are the co-ministry team there. And we're delighted to welcome you, Shauna. We're going to have an opportunity, all of us as a community, to hear from her tomorrow afternoon on the topic of love, and this afternoon to just introduce herself to us and share a bit of her story. So welcome, welcome, Shauna. Shauna Lingood.
I want to thank Nancy and Chris for having me, because it's quite something to be invited to come from Victoria, and quite something more to be invited to come to Canada from the US, because many people, as soon as I start talking, say, "You're not from around here." And indeed, I grew up in the suburbs of Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, and still consider myself to some extent a Philly girl, a fan of Philly soul, Philly cheesesteaks, Philly soft pretzels, Philly sports teams, Philly everything. There's a lot to love about Philadelphia in all of its pain and beauty. And I grew up in a single-parent home. My mother was a social worker, and she was often off doing adoption home studies or working for the county that we lived in. I look at Scott since he's a social worker. And so I had a lot of time as a kid to myself. I was what a lot of people would call a latchkey kid. When my school day was done, I would take my key, I'd get on the school bus, I'd go home, and I'd let myself in. And I'd have a lot of time, hours each day to myself, to try to figure out who I was and what I was doing. And so even as a small child, I remember having a lot of time sitting thinking, who am I? And what am I meant to do with my life? And what really matters? You could do lots of things, but only some of them really matter. And I thought, what do I want to do? What can I do to make the most of this one chance, for all I know, to be alive? What do I want to do to make the most of it before I die? And I started thinking those things pretty young. I probably should have known I was destined for ministry, that I was thinking that around 10. And as I grew up, I actually grew up as a part of a Unitarian Universalist community, which somebody at my table was just like, that doesn't happen very much, does it? You Unitarian folks are mostly kind of new to the faith tradition. But my mother, actually, when she and my dad split and we moved away together, she was one of those wise people who knew she needed community. And some of the first people she met in our apartment building were part of the Unitarian Church. And they said, come to church with us. And she wisely accepted their offer. And those people have been my people ever since, much like Ruth, right? Your people will be my people. And so my mother's people, the Unitarian Universalist people, became my people. And I think of them as the people who raised me. And the congregation that I grew up in suburban Philadelphia, in Media, Pennsylvania, to be precise, just like the press, they were a very strongly rationalist, humanist congregation. So I used to say that the sermons I heard most Sundays were like a college lecture, deeply enriching, full of lots of footnotes, but not necessarily that spiritually deep or meaningful. And I thought they were fantastic. My ministers as a kid and all of my friends were, that was kind of my spiritual community, was my saving grace. And when things got really hard in high school, as things evolved in my own life, I thought, it's a darn good thing I have this community. Where would I be without these people? How would I know who I am without these people? And so as the years flew by, and there I was in high school trying to figure out a little bit more about how I was going to fit in and who I was meant to become, who I didn't want to become, I was in my high school years, and a few of the losses started to pile up, believe it or not. My sort of, life will just go on and it'll be fine, started to be interrupted by some tragedies, and in particular, someone that I had been a part of my youth group circles, kind of my larger Unitarian Universalist youth group circles, had been killed on his college campus due to gun violence on his campus. And so at that time, suddenly the rationalist, humanist stuff that I'd been getting, the college lectures, weren't taking me as far as I wanted them to anymore. I didn't know what to make of my friend Galen's death, and I wasn't quite sure what to make of all of this. It felt like the questions of life that I had been asking ever since I'd been letting myself into my house as a kid had become more insistent, and it felt like the stakes were suddenly much, much higher than I had ever imagined. And then I went off to college, and I made the very smart decision of deciding to study with Quakers. And I went off to college in North Carolina, and I was at a Quaker school, and I was this kind of rabid agnostic, I don't know and you don't either, and I was trying to throw away all kinds of spiritual language. And one of my professors looked at me, a really wise Quaker gentleman, and he said, Shauna, if you really have no use for any of these words, if the word grace means nothing to you, then by all means, throw it out. He could see the look on my face. I didn't really want to throw out grace, right? If the word blessing means nothing to you, then go ahead, throw it out. But if you have need of some of these words that you're so angry about, you might want to figure out if there isn't still some meaning for you, and if you want to claim and reclaim those words and not let other people define them for you, because that's what I'd been doing. And during the same time, my college years, I was really starting to sort of reclaim and claim my feminism, claim and reclaim my African American heritage. In particular, I audited this class that changed my life on the Harlem Renaissance. So if you get me at a table later and you ask me about the Harlem Renaissance, you may regret it. But it was starting to explore my African American heritage that actually led me to being a theist that you find before you today. Because I couldn't hear some of the spirituals, I couldn't hear some of the slave songs that my ancestors had sung to get them through the horrific, unimaginable experience of slavery, and think, well, if it worked for them, can't work for me. And so there I was in college starting to explore these things, and I would hear songs like, "Wade in the water, wade in the water, children, wade in the water. God's gonna trouble the water." And then I would say to myself, what's this troubling the water thing? And recently, I finally decided to do some research because it never made sense to me that God would trouble the water, right? You get the image of Harriet Tubman leading people through waters, through the Underground Railroad to freedom, and singing that song to each other. See that band all dressed in white, God's gonna trouble the water. The leader looks like an Israelite, God's gonna trouble the water, right? Getting so exuberant, my microphone's falling off. So then I said, trouble the water, and I looked it up. And they didn't mean trouble like make it harder to get through the water. They didn't mean trouble like more waves, more difficulty. They meant trouble. God troubling the water was God putting the Spirit into the water, God making it more possible, I like to envision it, more possible for the dogs to not smell your scent in the water, more possible for you to survive this horrible, unimaginable, dehumanizing, talk about dehumanizing experience of being enslaved. And so the more I looked at these songs, the more I thought that, yes, I was not a person who could ever believe in a transcendent white guy on a throne with a large beard. And somehow I imagined that my ancestors didn't believe in that God either. I don't know how many of you have read The Color Purple, but Alice Walker's image of God, that's the God I believe in, that if you cut a tree, my arm would bleed. I believe in a God, in a force, in a presence that is an energy that is beyond naming and even beyond comprehension. It's that God that I think troubled the water for my ancestors. I suppose you could say that now I have evolved into being someone who is kind of a process theist. I believe that God is here with us, growing and changing and weeping, rooting for us to find our way, even though we seem to love to get lost again and again and again. Wanting us, willing us to co-create something better than what we have today, even though we seem to always want to argue with each other, fight with each other, find ways to be disagreeable in every possible way. And so this weekend, I'm here with you to look at what our humanity might mean if we are a humanity that is going to love and co-create right alongside the God I didn't believe in, and yet somehow came to find here in my mid-40s that I do. Who might that God be for you, if not the white guy on the throne in the sky? And if you don't believe in God, which maybe some of you don't, what is that spirit that gets you out of bed each morning, that reminds you of who you are and that niggles at your heart when it knows that something more could and should be done to make the earth a more hospitable place for all people, all creation, all the time? I look forward to talking with you more tomorrow.
We're going to sing again. And if you would like to have an opportunity to move from the sitting position that you're in, this is a great opportunity to do that. We're going to sing about the communities we're creating and welcoming each other to the tables where we're gathered, together, not alone. We're going to sing.
So as we get ready to close this session, it's our hope that we continue to explore different aspects of our humanity this weekend. To be intellectual about it, to be practical about it, to be emotional about it, to be relational about it. That we might be invited into new ideas and practices this weekend, and more than that, into new relationships where we can share a piece of our humanity with another and help each other along the way. We have the great privilege of being able to be led tonight in the next little while through this session by 4 very wonderful individuals who will lead us through a time of thoughtfulness and intellectual stimulation. So Margaret Hetherington, come on.
Thank you, Chris. It's going to be even more stimulating than we thought. Well, welcome. I want you to get serious now. We're into keynote speaker time. Like, our first keynote speaker is just about to arrive. Not quite yet, but soon. So welcome to our first 2019 keynote session. And your leadership team for tonight is Claire Woodbury, Joyce Madsen, Sheila Parsons, and myself, Margaret. I wanted to tell you that this past year, the 4 of us as a team have had a lot of fun here at SSUC Edmonton, and also with SSUC Saskatoon live streaming, because we led a book study earlier, ambitiously comparing Bishop Spong's Unbelievable, Catherine Osmond's Grace Without God, and Parker Palmer's On the Brink of Everything. Just, we were a little overly zealous. 3 books, major books, and 1 study. Anyway, we had a great time. And then we created a Sunday spiritual gathering this summer, and now we're honored to be involved in tonight's session. Our leadership team has really become a source and experience of deep friendship and growth. And we would like to recommend this as a wonderful model for healthy leadership. You know, enough people, enough relationship building time, and stimulated learning. Well, and now, through the wonders of modern technology, we welcome Karen Armstrong into our midst. I'm really delighted to be introducing her. Outstanding author of more than 50 books, I found 69 listed online. More than 50 books on God, the world's religions and leaders, scriptures, compassion, and more. And here's just a sampling from our personal libraries and the church library. Karen Armstrong is a fellow of the Jesus Seminar. She is a winner of the 2008 TED Prize, and as you know, driving force in the worldwide creation of the Charter for Compassion, which was launched in 2009, and which has an estimated 2 million supporters today, and 400 partner compassionate communities. Karen Armstrong is a renowned educator and commentator concerning world religions, bringing much knowledge and much challenge to all of the misinformation that is circulated in these days of extreme religious fanaticism, especially since 9/11. Many of you will have read her books, right? Many of you. That's why we're here tonight, right? In her presence soon. Yes, you've read her books and you know some of her story, from childhood to convent to careers to compassion. Indeed, Karen Armstrong is one of the most well-accomplished global citizens that I can think of. Now, just before turning to her keynote presentation, we wanted to share a clip to remind us that life for all of us is always much more complicated and sometimes more painful than it appears. So here Karen Armstrong gives us a small glimpse into some of her own personal pain and her deepening journey toward compassion.
I myself, as a young woman, was extraordinarily unhappy. When I left my convent, I existed in a state of depression, I think, for about 6 years. Because everyone thought it would be great, you know, I'd be leaping out, going out with men, sort of wearing beautiful clothes, traveling, making money. I was utterly lost because it was a very difficult transition to make. It was a kind of bereavement, not unlike a bad divorce. And I also suffered from a neurological illness, birth injury, which was giving me dreadful moments of terror and anguish and pain and fear. And it wasn't diagnosed, not until I was in my mid-30s. So I was in and out of mental hospitals, and I thought I was anorexic, I was suicidal. I thought I was going to end my days in a locked ward. Happiest day was when I got my diagnosis, and then I could move on. But even then, everything I did till I was about 50 failed. Every 6 years ago, everything I've been working for went down the tube. I failed my PhD with horrible publicity. Then I went into school teaching, and because of my health, I was asked to leave, and I was invalided out. Then I went into television. I said that to Bill Moyers, the great American broadcaster, and he said, "Oh, we take anybody." And and after 6 years, that ended in absolute disaster too. And after that, I went off. My life was just emptied because all my associates and friends in that world had gone. And I was living in a very remote part of East Finchley. It was all I could afford, and I was absolutely alone. Now that you would think might be a bad thing, but in fact it wasn't too bad, because I was starting to research my book called A History of God. And my books up until that point had been extremely angry, very mad with religion, and clever, sniping, and small, I think. And this started to change because there was just me and the texts. There was no television crew to egg me on to be outrageous. And the text started to speak to me in a new way, because theology is poetry. And you can't read a poem in a nightclub. You have to have a certain silence and reciprocity. And I found a footnote in a very sort of scholarly tome, and it was talking about an abstruse form of Islamic spirituality. And it said that the historian of religion must not approach the spiritualities of the past from the vantage point of post-Enlightenment rationalism. You've got to empty yourself of your preconceptions and enter into the mind of those people who thought these things. He called it the science of compassion. Science, not in the sense of physics or chemistry, but scientia, knowledge that comes from feeling with the other. And so in a scholarly way, he said, you have to build up a picture of what's going on in that world, culturally, economically, politically, intellectually. What were the problems of that society? And not leave yourself until you can imagine yourself feeling the same. If you can do that, he said, this was Louis Massignon, the great Islamist scholar, he said, if you can do that, you will broaden your horizons and make a room for the other in your mind and heart. And I thought that struck me. I thought that's what I must do. That meant I had to put clever, over-educated Karen on the back burner for 6 hours a day and enter into other people's minds and hearts.
We're going to take you now to Kentucky. 3 years ago for the Faith Conference and the Festival of Faith. I think you don't need to read too far in any newspaper these days to realize how badly this world needs compassion. And our brief conversation ahead of this I realized how seldom we experience compassion. And maybe if I want to lay a little guilt trip on myself, how seldom I've shown compassion. But compassion is one of the things that Karen Armstrong really knows. You just have to read her book, 12 Steps to Compassion, to realize the depth of this woman's compassion. And so we're going to listen to, it's a fairly lengthy video, and it's a little slow at starting. You have to just be a little patient about the titles, 30 seconds. And then at the end, we'll have time for some conversation about what we've heard. So pay attention. There may be a test, and maybe not.
I'm standing before you at another awful time. There's been more Islamophobia now in the United States since 9/11, this last year. And you may notice I am struggling with a very bad cough, and I've just had some stuff given to me for it. But Tori noticed that the cough started just about the time when Donald Trump was landing at the airport. But it's really great to be here in Louisville. I've enjoyed my visits here before, but this time coming back, it's very special because Louisville has become absolutely central to our project for building a network of compassionate cities. Louisville has become one of the best of our cities, determined somehow to implement, to insert the difficult virtue of compassion into the gritty reality of urban life in the 21st century. And it's absolutely crucial that this is done. Because if compassion remains simply an airy notion, sort of kumbaya, a soft option where people are just nice to one another in their private lives, and somehow do not make it work politically or socially, I really feel we have very little hope of handing the next generation with a viable world. Because I've come to the conclusion that compassion is not just a nice idea, it's now an urgent global imperative. I came to this with difficulty. I had not experienced religion, for example, as a compassionate enterprise, to put it mildly. But I wrote a book called The Great Transformation, when all our great world religious traditions came into being at about the same time, in India, in the Middle East, and in Greece, in Europe. And every single one of them, in their own way, quite independently, came to the conclusion that the bedrock of spirituality and ethics was what we now call the Golden Rule. Never treat others as you would not like to be treated yourself. And insisted that this, and not a particular belief or a doctrine or a political position, this was at the heart of all our religious traditions. It was the test of true spirituality. And yet, I was getting frustrated because you heard so little about it. Very often when religious leaders come together, they were often here to condemn something, like condemn homosexuality, for example, or coming to profess a particular doctrine. But you didn't hear about this one thing that the world needs at the moment. Because unless now we learn to implement the Golden Rule globally, and it begins in cities, I think, the world is simply not going to be viable for it, because we've not done it in the past, and we're now beginning to reap some of the rewards of this. The Golden Rule requires you to look into your own heart, discover what gives you pain, and then refuse under any circumstance whatsoever to inflict that pain on anybody else. Never treat others as you would not like to be treated yourself. One of the first people to propose the Golden Rule in a way that was written down was Confucius in the 5th century BCE. And he said, you do this all day and every day, not just when you feel like it. It has to become an absolute habitual practice. In England, we have a habit when we've done something nice for somebody, we often say, well, that's my good deed for the day, as though we could then return to the next 23 hours to our usual habits of greed and unkindness and bitterness. No, all day and every day. And it requires you to transcend the self. That is why it's so important in spirituality. Now, they all insisted too that you could not confine this benevolence to your own particular group. You had to have what another Chinese sage called yan ai, concern for everybody. You have this in the monotheistic traditions too. Love the stranger, the foreigner, says Leviticus. If a foreigner lives with you in your land, do not molest him. You must treat him as one of your own people and love him as yourself, for you were strangers in Egypt. And here you have the logic of the Golden Rule. Remember the times when you were a despised, oppressed, marginalized minority in a foreign land in Egypt, and make sure that nobody in your vicinity, in your own country, has to suffer such pain in your society. And the word love, I think, needs decoding here, because one of the problems we're having with compassion is that it's got kind of soft and mushy, a bit full of kumbaya, and that this toughness tends to be dissipated. Love, for example, in English has got really debased. You know, I love ice cream. Didn't you love that movie? Or else it suggests a sort of great welling of emotion. But in the ancient Near East, at the time Leviticus was written, love, hesed in Hebrew, was a political term, political legal term used in treaties, international treaties. Two kings who may have been enemies previously would promise to love each other. And that didn't mean that they would fall into one another's arms and become best friends, best buddies. Love meant loyalty. It meant that they would look out for one another's best interests, even if this went against their own short-term goals. That they would come to their aid of their new ally when he was in trouble. And they would do all they could to give him practical help and support. Now, this is the kind of love we need to give our so-called enemies today if we want a peaceful world. And Jesus said, love your enemies here. And the fate of Jesus reminds us that compassion can be dangerous. Here's a man who, in the Gospel of Mark, at the end of chapter 1 of this earliest of the Gospels, is so besieged by suffering, desperate people that he can't leave the city. We sometimes read the Gospel piecemeal in church. We don't get the full effect of this. Jesus is claustrophobically surrounded by suffering people at the end of their tether. They're sick, they're blind, they're deaf, and many of them are deranged, demented, filled with, they said, devils. And the Gospel says that they are struck down with, the Greek words used mean that he looked at them and he saw that they were hard-pressed, and the Greek words used means with imperial predation. Jesus was a political figure, and he was killed by the Roman authorities for asking for a fairer, more compassionate world. And other people we've seen in the 20th century, Dr. King, Gandhi, who preached the compassionate ethic very effectively, but paid the ultimate price. So in becoming a compassionate city, one's taking on a great risk and a great challenge. And it won't always be easy. It's not about being nice. I personally am not filled with peace and love and joy. If I'm filled with anything, it's a kind of dread. I never intended to get into all this business about talking about religion or writing about Islam. My goal was to be a university professor teaching English literature, and it didn't happen. But a turning point for me was during the Salman Rushdie crisis. And there, if you remember, the Ayatollah Khomeini, on his deathbed, his government had issued a fatwa saying that the Salman Rushdie and his supporters and his publishers could be killed. This was outrageous, went against major Islamic and indeed Iranian Shiite ideology. And of course I was dead against that. But I was also utterly horrified by the way the liberal intellectuals of Britain, and these were not just little unknown people, they were major novelists, philosophers, intellectuals, and journalists, segued from an out-and-out denunciation of the fatwa to a denunciation of Islam as an essentially evil and bloodthirsty religion. And I remember sitting surrounded by the Sunday papers and thinking that this reminded me of the 1930s and 1940s. It was this kind of rhetoric used by Hitler that had made the concentration camps possible, by dehumanizing. And at the end of that decade, at the end of the 90s, there were concentration camps again around the periphery of Europe, this time with Muslims in them, in Bosnia. So there's that kind of dread and urgency I have. So, as I say, it's hard work, and we have somehow to find a way to grapple with the political realities of our time and make compassion, to feel with the other, to treat others, all others, as we would wish to be treated ourselves, a real reality. If we British had behaved with more respect to the people in our colonies during the 18th, 19th, and 20th centuries, we would not be having so many political problems today. Things are coming back to haunt us. Now, the people who founded the Golden Rule, started it up, were all living not in peaceful, idyllic groves. Like Jesus, they were living in times where violence and injustice and suffering had reached an unbearable crescendo. China, for example, at the time of Confucius, was just embarking on a terrible period of Chinese history. It's often called the Warring States period, because for over 200 years, all the states, the small states on the big Great Plain of China, fought one another with desperate, terrible casualties for over 200 years, most of the casualties among the peasantry, until there was only one state left. The others were all destroyed, and that became the Chinese Empire. And Confucius his golden rule was not just a private imperative, though it was that too. His whole life was spent tramping from one court to another, trying to make the rulers of China observe the golden rule. Because he said, if we don't behave to each other as we would wish others to behave to us, we will destroy one another. And that has never been more true than it is today. A little while ago, I think it was 2 or 3 years ago, I did a video link up. I think perhaps it was with this festival in Louisville. And I was in London at home and was speaking to an audience somewhere. And somebody asked me, what should a compassionate city look like? What should it be like? And I said, a compassionate city should be an uncomfortable city. Why? Because, and here, I'm sure I'll be corrected if I'm wrong, but I believe the Prophet Muhammad once, peace be upon him, once said, not one of you can be a believer if he can sleep when he knows that someone is hungry. And we know, because we are inundated with images of suffering and pain more than any previous generation. We know that not only are people hungry, they are on flimsy boats, little rafts, literally dying to get into Europe. They are enduring on a daily basis what the Europeans endured for 1 or 2, 3 days last year. There's hunger, and there's disease and massive inequity. And sometimes, you know, when we look at these, we get, someone called it once, compassion fatigue. We think, oh, I can't deal with this, I don't want to see it. But we should see it as a spiritual opportunity. We should perhaps fix on one of those images, perhaps a child. One I'm thinking of was literally dying in its mother's arms in a refugee camp in Europe. And call it during the day and let it trouble us. Because that trouble, that discomfort that we feel when we are living lives of such utter privilege here, that is like the grain of sand in the oyster that creates the pearl. And it's that discomfort that creates true compassion. To allow ourselves to realize, not to be miserable all the time, that's not the point, but that won't help anybody. But to say what could we practically do to assuage this? It's about pain. Look into your own heart, discover what gives you pain, and then refuse under any circumstances that not to do this to anybody else. Now, we are living in an interconnected world. We're linked together, our economies are so interdependent that when markets fall in one part of the world, stocks plummet all around the globe that day. we all face the same environmental possibility of disaster. We're linked together electronically in a way that would once have been conceivable on the World Wide Web. People can look into their phones now and see the way we live. No wonder they want to come to our privileged world. And yet, the more global we become, the more tribal people want to feel. We've got this ludicrous thing going on, a terribly dangerous thing going on in Britain at the moment. Should Britain leave the European Union? And people are saying absurd things like, oh, we must be proud again. Rubbish. Rubbish. We need Europe. 100 years ago, Europeans were killing one another in these disastrous wars. The fact that we're sitting round table, however ineptly, tackling day-to-day problems is a triumph. Scotland tried to leave the European Union. And the United Kingdom, to go it alone. Fortunately, that did not work out, that wish. So, similarly, in the religious world, the more global our vision comes with interfaith, the more some people want to retreat to denominational ghettos. That's why you have fundamentalism, where people feel threatened by this likeness and want to hold on to this nugget of individuality. But this is not a rational assessment. I think the Dalai Lama has said this. This is not a rational assessment of our current situation, which is interdependence. So the suffering we're seeing in other parts of the world has already redounded on us. And this is in no way condoning these terrorist acts, but this has come from decades of neglect and selfishness and pursuit of the wrong kind of policies, not supporting rulers or regimes in various countries of the world that would give their people none of the liberties that we enjoy. We're not doing it. That's not the golden rule. Don't impose on others, said Confucius, what you yourself do not desire. Now, we had some bad days in Europe. I mentioned them. And this is heartbreaking. One of the things that's happening, you see, is that we are now in the privileged West are beginning to endure some of the privations that people in these other countries that we've been helping to keep in this bad state have felt all along. There are certain places now where it's not really safe for us to go on holiday. Our world is beginning to shrink. When we go through the airport, we have all this palaver with, taking our shoes off and looking out, and we all get frightened when something like Egypt Air happens. Is it another terrorist attack? But this is only a pinprick of the fear and lack of freedom that people have around the world, which is these migrants. Now, the Charlie Hebdo massacre in January was it was an atrocious crime. An atrocious crime. But when I saw those European and world leaders linking arms and marching together for freedom and liberté and freedom of expression, I felt quite sick, because many of them, including my own Prime Minister, had, as I say, for decades supported regimes like Saudi Arabia in Muslim-majority countries which allow their people no freedom of expression at all. And we only seem to mourn our own people. A few weeks before that Paris catastrophe, 145 Pakistani children had been shot dead by the Taliban. Just a day or two after, 2,000 villagers men, women, children, and the elderly had been slaughtered by Boko Haram. Small, tiny mentions in the press compared with the Paris bonanza. And this is noticed in the Muslim world. The other day, Tori gave us that magnificent talk where she showed the number of people who've died. 90% of the people who have died in Afghanistan and Iraq in the wars were civilians who were simply in the wrong place at the wrong time. And yet, we never really mention them. We quite rightly mourn our dead servicemen who come back from these terrible places and have paid the ultimate price. But we must also remember these others too. Otherwise, it looks as though we think that some lives are more valuable than others. And you know, this is not unnoticed. Just shortly after that Paris catastrophe, I visited Jordan, and I was giving a talk to a small group. It was a closed group, no cameras or anything, they were members of the royal family, diplomats, statesmen, members of the diplomatic community. And one of them, and these were not a bunch of hotheads, one of them was the foreign minister who had brokered the peace treaty with Israel. And he said, you know, the West has lost its humanity. You don't care about our dead. The fact that one of the princesses got up and said, we are also terrorized by these people. Far more Muslims have died at the hands of extremists than Western people. And as I said earlier, that day in Paris was just a pinprick to what these people have been enduring in Syria. Paris would have been an almost daily occurrence. After the last attack, Paris attack in November, 2 days earlier, 44 people in Beirut had been killed by 2 IS suicide bombers. And they were never mentioned. As soon as we died, then up went the tricolor, the French flag on every building. Why not the Lebanese flag too? And the Lebanese noticed it. They said that none of this matters, that we don't matter. This is not a good feeling to spread around the world. We're not seeing that compassion, that fellow feeling. Your pain is my pain.
The principle of compassion lies at the heart of all religious, ethical, and spiritual traditions,
calling us always to treat all others as we wish to be treated ourselves.
Compassion impels us to work tirelessly to alleviate the suffering of our fellow creatures.
To dethrone ourselves from the center of our world and put another there.
To honor the inviolable sanctity of every single human being.
Treating everybody without exception.
With absolute justice, equity, and respect.
It is also necessary in both public and private life
to refrain consistently and empathically from inflicting pain.
To act or speak violently out of spite, chauvinism, or self-interest.
To impoverish, exploit, or deny basic rights to anybody.
And to incite hatred by denigrating others, even our enemies.
Is a denial of our common humanity.
We acknowledge that we have failed to live compassionately.
And that some have even increased the sum of human misery in the name of religion.
We therefore call upon all men and women
to restore compassion
to the center of morality and religion,
to return to the ancient principle
that any interpretation of Scripture
that breeds violence,
hatred,
or disdain
is illegitimate.
To ensure that youth are given accurate and respectful information
about other traditions, religions, and cultures.
To encourage a positive appreciation
of cultural and religious diversity.
To cultivate
an informed empathy
with the suffering of all human beings,
even those
regarded as enemies.
We urgently need to make compassion a clear, luminous, and dynamic force in our polarized world.
Rooted in a principled determination to transcend selfishness.
Compassion can break down political, dogmatic, ideological, and religious boundaries.
Born of our deep interdependence, compassion is essential for human relationships and to a fulfilled humanity.
It is the path to enlightenment and indispensable in the creation of a just economy and a peaceful global community.